detail what comes of a kind of liberal elite's attempt to make the most of an incremental change within the system. And we can wonder who exactly the parallel is to today in our own moment. But he's pretty savage about what happens to liberal elites who try to, or what happens to change when liberal elites try to bind themselves to a system and change it from within. I have to say, looking at the ascent of Biden, which I certainly prefer over the alternative, I wonder if it is possible that a kind of repeat of 2008 could take place, where we also felt we were in a crisis, where we also felt, well, this time we understand the crisis of capitalism and we're not just going to let government lead, but we're going to continue to lead from the streets. And instead we kind of sat back, and I heard someone describe it recently as we allowed our movements to transition to movies, where we just kind of watched things play out. Chris, I know that you were intoning against all of that back then, and you are no doubt the same today. How are you positioning yourself vis-a-vis this moment, whatever it is, 5 days ahead of an election?
It depends on how you read the system, which is why the 18th Brumaire is important. So if you have a functioning system, let's say, go back and look at the Watergate scandal around Richard Nixon. There you have the ability by the part of liberal small L elite, Democratic elite, both Republican and Democrat, to remove a president. The question, which I think Marx asks, is whether we are in something that is sui generis and perhaps more dangerous. And that is whether we have reached a moment in which political rot, coupled with personal incompetence, even buffoonery, will lead to a full-scale, systematic, constitutional crisis. And I would argue that that's where we are, that at this point, the system has seized up to such an extent because of the dominance of corporate power, that the incremental and piecemeal reform that is the role of a liberal elite to ameliorate the worst or most egregious aspects of capitalist democracy, to confront a patently corrupt political mandarin such as Trump, no longer works. And that puts us into the kind of territory that Marx was writing about. Marx understood, and I think elucidated perhaps better than anyone, the peculiar dynamics of unfettered capitalism. He understood that capitalism has built within it the seeds of its own destruction. So when capitalism is no longer constrained, and essentially given free rein by an ideology such as neoliberalism, which never made any economic sense. This was an ideology, David Harvey, I think, has written very well on this in A Brief History of Neoliberalism. When capitalism essentially cloaks itself in absurdist ideology, there's nothing in economic history going back probably thousands of years that to justify the seizure of wealth and power by a tiny elite as somehow beneficial either economically or politically, then what you see is a kind of what Marx would argue is a kind of cannibalization of the very system that supports capitalism itself. And so when you, for instance, when you offshore all of your jobs, then you reduce the ability of wage earners within the economy. That makes it harder for speculators who take over to amass profits. And then what they do is begin to feed on the very system itself. That's why you privatize schools. That's why you privatize utilities. And then you begin to eat away. You begin to hollow out the very structures that makes the state possible. And I think that's clearly where we are. Joe Biden, I don't think Joe Biden has any real ideological, moral, or intellectual core. He has shifted with the winds. He's abjectly served corporate power his entire time in public office. They used to call him Senator Credit Card. He is an architect of the endless war, one of the cheerleaders for the endless wars in the Middle East. He passed the omnibus crime bill that exploded the prison population. He has called throughout his political career for cuts in Social Security. He was a friend of segregationists. And he was anointed by the corporate elites, the oligarchic elites, who can live with Trump, but prefer somebody who has more decorum and is less of an embarrassment to the empire. But that means that the very engine of corporate capitalism, which is already destroyed, I think, most democratic institutions, and as Carl Polanyi would say, turned the economy into a mafia state, will accelerate. And that gets back to Marx, because when you marry a decayed or rotten system with a corrupt ruling class, then you raise the possibility of very seismic and dangerous political movements. So I have not voted for a Democrat and will not vote for, I've already voted. I voted for the Green Party, but that's just what I've done since before 2000. A lot of that's personal. I have spent months of my life in Gaza. It's the plight of the Palestinians is not an abstraction. As Cornel knows, I teach in a prison. The lives of my students and their families were destroyed. I mean, half of them wouldn't even be there, but for figures like Biden. So there's just, I'm not arguing that it's politically practical, but it's a kind of personal loyalty. But I think what we will see if Biden wins, and again, I don't think in any way that that is foreordained, but if Biden wins, we've already created such a media gulf, we've bifurcated the country into these antagonistic tribes that no longer have the capacity to communicate, that no longer have a common narrative. You will get that stabbed in the back mantra from Trump, and you will see an acceleration of the kind of right-wing neo-fascist violence that I saw in Yugoslavia. And I'll just end by saying that there are many, many parallels to the breakdown of Yugoslavia. I think what people forget who weren't there or didn't study it is that these ethnic militias who wanted to put on camo uniforms and carry AK-47s were posturing in the same way that the Proud Boys and these other neo-fascist groups posture. They weren't actually looking for violence. They certainly weren't looking for a war. But once you begin this dance, you eventually, and we've already come close to it several times. Portland saw an Antifa supporter gunned down assassinated in the same way that people were at Piers from the New York Times story. People were gunned down in extrajudicial killings, the kind of things I saw in Argentina or later in El Salvador. And then we had, of course, a member of the right-wing Patriot Prayer Group allegedly killed by an Antifa supporter. We just got a report the other day that somebody was driving with a van full of weapons to assassinate Biden, all sorts of death threats against figures like Representative Ilhan Omar. A couple of years ago, we had a Trump supporter mail pipe bombs to CNN and most of the hierarchy of the Democratic Party, which if they'd gone off would have decapitated the Democratic Party. There is going to come a point when one of these movements will begin to succeed. And once that blood gets shed, once you create martyrs, in essence, and this was fundamental to the rise of fratricide in Yugoslavia, then the killing starts. And we are a culture, as Richard Slotkin has, I think, amply demonstrated. We are a deeply violent culture. Hofstadter as well. I was Cornel, gave me his book on violence. And we are awash in military-grade weapons, and the rage, and much of it is a legitimate rage by a dispossessed white working class, and that sense of the inability to communicate across this media divide, which has now even papers like the New York Times have essentially chosen sides. 91% of the readership of the Times support the Democratic Party. You just saw the censorship of the information on Hunter Biden's laptop. Even the Biden camp is not arguing that it's fictitious in the same way that the Podesta emails in 2016 weren't fictitious, but and then you get the media platforms. That's all very dangerous because people then only speak within their own echo chambers. So I think the country is unraveling. I think that Biden is a disastrous choice. I think that the violence with or without Trump is going to be ratcheted up. And I find so many parallels to the disintegration in Yugoslavia, which of course vomited up these Foonish figures, Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, which are very Trump-like.
Thank you. The very end of the Brumaire essay seems worth reading just because it so reflects the moment we're in my view.